The following program is a presentation of the Civil War Broadcasting Network, available on the free YouTube channel General Grant by Himself or Dr. E.C. Fields, on the Facebook page Kurt Fields as General Ulysses S. Grant, and on various other social media. The website is generalgrantbyhimself.com. This program is one of those presentations in the ongoing series General Grant Looks at the American Civil War, wherein General Grant looks at a person, place, or event or events in the Civil War for reflection and observation. Permission to copy and distribute is given and indeed encouraged. Remember, you are the future of our past. And now, General Grant. Welcome. I'm General of the Army Ulysses S. Grant, and you join me here today in my library where I shall reflect upon the rivers in the Civil War, their import, and my use of them to ultimately win the war. I knew early on that the rivers would be absolutely critical because they were the primary sources of moving great numbers of men and material, and they penetrated the South. And we could more easily get into the South and conquer that territory. I was stationed in Cairo, Illinois in August and September of 61. I got information on September the 5th that Confederates were marching on Paducah, Kentucky. They had violated Kentucky declared neutrality by going into Columbus, Kentucky on the Mississippi River and also Hickman, Kentucky nearby. So they were the aggressors. My spy advised me on the night of the 5th that they were marching on Paducah to take it as well. Now that was critical because Paducah, Kentucky is at the confluence of the Tennessee and the Ohio rivers, two major waterways. Also, a bit back on the Tennessee River, the Cumberland River joins it. The Tennessee River flows down through Tennessee, dividing West and Middle Tennessee, nips the northeastern corner of the state of Mississippi, flows or goes back to the east all the way across Alabama, curving back north around the Bridgeport, Alabama area, and goes up into Knoxville, Tennessee, where it originates. So to lose the Tennessee River, the mouth of it, to the Confederacy would have been devastating. To lose the Ohio would have been devastating. Indeed, the Cumberland as well. We took Paducah. I went up there about 45 miles north of Cairo, Illinois. And on the morning of September the 6th of 61, with 3 steamboats and 2 gunboats for fire support, we unloaded 2 regiments and some cavalry and 2 guns and 2 bands. I had 2 bands playing because I wanted the people of Paducah, Kentucky to know who was coming. We did not play any Confederate songs. So we secured Paducah. I went back to Cairo and was again planning my next move. The next move of major import involved the Tennessee River again. During an earlier exercise, General Charles Ferguson Smith had advised me that he thought we could take Forts Heiman and Henry very, very easily. And I applied to my superior officer, General Henry Halleck, to do so, and he denied me. I asked to see him. He denied. I asked to see him again. He allowed that. I tried to put forth the idea of taking Forts Henry and Heiman and Fort Donelson on the Cumberland River, and he dismissed me out of hand. When I told Flag Officer Andrew Hull Foote, who was supervising the construction of 3 ironclads there in Mound City, Illinois, very close to Cairo, he was enamored of the idea, and he wrote letters to General Halleck urging him to let us do this. And Halleck, after Flag Officer Foote urged it, said we could do it. So Andrew Hullfoot and myself began planning to take Fort Henry and Fort Donelson. So on February the 6th of 62, we set sail and had several 3 to 4 gunboats and several steamers, and we were going to do a joint operation. Foote was going to steam up to Fort Henry right on the Tennessee River at water level, and I was going to take my troops and go around and come in from the back of the fort, some 3 acres size total, and take the fort. Lord Tillman was in command and had indeed evacuated his troops, and all but 100 had gone the 12 miles to the east to Fort Donelson. Foote sailed up to point blank range and engaged Tillman, and they fought for about an hour. Tillman's gunners acquitted themselves well, but Foote ultimately destroyed all the guns, and they were standing in 2 feet of water. The fort was not well placed. And Tillman indeed rowed a boat out to Flag Officer Foote and then surrendered. So it was a Navy victory, which did not chagrin me whatever. We were mired in the mud and the trees, trying to get through creeks that ordinarily would have been dry, but now they're full of water from the heavy rains. And I immediately, after we took Fort Henry on the 6th, see, that secured the Tennessee River. And as I said earlier, that gave us the Tennessee River all the way down north to south in Tennessee, across Alabama, and then back up south to north in Tennessee with the back door to Chattanooga. We moved on Fort Donelson then. I thought optimistically I could take it in a couple of days, but the weather turned bad. It got to where the temps were 10 below zero, snow, sleeting snow, and we invested the fort on the 13th of February. Flag Officer Foote brought his flotilla of 3 ironclads and 2 timberclads, and was thinking he could do the same thing with Fort Donelson that he had done with Fort Henry. He could not. Fort Henry gave him a pounding. All of his boats were seriously damaged. I think all but one were beyond service. And then and that was on February the 14th. The men like to grimly joke that Foote exchanged iron valentines with the Confederate gunners, whom we have found out later to have been the best that they had that were brought in for such an engagement. But on the 16th, we took Fort Donelson. They surrendered to us, and that gave us not only a complete rebel army, some 17,000 men and a number of guns, but it gave us control of the Cumberland River, which went directly into the capital of Nashville, Tennessee. We soon took Nashville, so now we've taken our first rebel capital, captured it, and it was never recaptured by the Confederates. And it's a major depot for the transfer of men and materials. And we've got control of the Tennessee River from the Ohio River at Paducah, Kentucky, all the way back to its source near Knoxville, Tennessee, with that valuable access to Chattanooga, which came into play later on. My next adventures were on the Mississippi, or rather, I should say the Tennessee. We moved into Pittsburgh Landing in Savannah, Tennessee, because we were after the railroad junction at Corinth, Mississippi. And it was all critical. The Mobile and Ohio north, Memphis and Charleston west, with the connection all the way to the Atlantic Ocean. It was absolutely critical that we have it. I used some 144, 150 steamboats to move 37,000 men to Pittsburgh Landing in Savannah, Tennessee. When I got there, I reassumed command on March the 17th. Half the army was at Savannah, so I moved that half of the army down to Pittsburgh Landing and got them all together. We began training. More than half my troops had not seen the elephant and preparing to move on Corinth. Sidney Johnston had a different agenda and attacked us on April the 6th and 7th. We fought the Battle of Shiloh. And the night of April 6th into April 7th, the Navy performed yeoman work by shuttling across the Tennessee River from the east bank to the west bank, some 20,000 troops in the Army of the Ohio under General Buell. And I was able to begin the second day of the battle with 20,000 fresh troops, which made a substantial difference. Moreover, the Tyler and the Lexington fired mortar rounds, heavy rounds, every 15 minutes all night into the rebel positions back from Pittsburgh Landing. So the Navy once again performed work as a transport agency in combined combat arms, and got an entire army across that river overnight. Then, after Shiloh, I went for a number of months until we became involved in the Vicksburg campaign. And we tried a number of efforts to get into Vicksburg. None of them worked. I didn't really expect any of them to work, but was prepared to take advantage of any of them that did. But what ultimately worked is what I had initially thought was going to be the way to get to Vicksburg. Down the Mississippi River, go south of Vicksburg, get into Mississippi, and come north into Vicksburg. And one effort that we tried was the Yazoo Pass expedition in February of '63, and we blew the dam at Moon Lake in Mississippi, not far south of Memphis, flooded the Yazoo Coldwater River, and tried to get Admiral David Dixon Porter, took several gunboats into the Yazoo Pass, but it was very narrow, thick woods, a tangled mass to try to get those heavy gunboats through, and the steamers with troops had tall stacks, and the trees kept knocking them down, and the rebels were behind them felling trees and blocking their way out, and they couldn't turn around. They'd have to back up. So they got, though, as far as Greenwood, Mississippi at Fort Pemberton, but it was at a right angle turn in the river, and Fort Pemberton only had 2 guns, but one of them, as I understand, was Whitworth rifled, fired bolts, breech-loading cannon, and they were deadly. So we couldn't get around the corner and within sight of the goal, coming into the area north of Vicksburg, they had to turn back. So they backed up and got out only by the hardest. And then, some 3 weeks or so later, on March the 15th, we went into Steele's Bayou. Porter went in with 5 gunboats, 3 mortar boats, and a number of steamers. And he pushed through that, and again, the bayous were so narrow that the sides of the gunboats were rubbing with the sides of the creeks and the bayous. Porter was afraid he was going to get stuck a couple of times, but he couldn't go. He went until he could go no further, and the water began to drop a bit, and he had to be rescued. Sherman went in after him with his army. And at one time, Sherman actually was in a canoe, rowing a canoe to get to the scene where Porter was jammed up in the bayous and Steele's Bayou. And they were able to fight, and they did extricate Porter, but only, again, by the hardest. And by March the 22nd, Porter was clear of Steele's Bayou and declared the campaign to be over. The next big involvement that Porter had with me, and he worked very well with me. I cannot praise Admiral Porter enough. We decided to run the batteries at Vicksburg. No light matter. There were only a couple of pilots or captains that could man boats, and we made it volunteer to crew the ships. So most of the sailors on the boats that did run the Vicksburg Battery were Army, and former riverboat men served as pilots. And on the night of April the 16th of 63, Admiral Porter led in his flagship, the Benton, some 10 ships, boats, with barges either in tow or lashed to their starboard side, the west bank side, and ran the batteries. Now, the batteries were run along 14 miles of river. So running the batteries is more than just one location. They were under constant fire for almost an hour. But they did it and only lost one ship. The Henry Clay, I think, was hit, set afire, and sank. But Porter ran the batteries. As it turned out, we didn't have as many, or needed more supplies than he was able to bring. So Admiral Porter ran them again. He went north past the batteries and brought down on April the 22nd, he brought down 6 more boats with some 12 barges lashed to them. So he ran them twice, and we were south of Vicksburg. We initially wanted to go across the river and get on the east bank, the same side as Pemberton, at Grand Gulf. Grand Gulf was a fortress on the Mississippi, heavily fortified, and Porter sailed up to them, gave them hard combat, but they gave him harder combat in return. Porter notified me that he wasn't going to be able to take Grand Gulf. We then began to move further south, and a runaway slave was taken in custody and brought to me, and he said that we could land at Bruinsburg, some 12 miles south, I think it was, of Port Gibson, Mississippi. And Port Gibson was the back door of Grand Gulf on the river. And Porter brought the boats together, and on the 30th of April, 1863, all day long, Admiral Porter moved 22,000 Federal soldiers from the Deschutes plantation on the west bank to Bruinsburg on the east bank. He got an entire army with artillery and such baggage as was absolutely required, no more. And I was on, by the end of the day on April 30th, the same side of the river as Pemberton on dry land with 22,000 men. That was the largest amphibious movement in history, and the Navy did it for us in one day. Perhaps even as remarkable, there was not a shot fired, and I didn't lose a single man or a single piece of equipment. Over the next several days, we got 11,000 more troops. So by May the 7th, I had 33,000 soldiers south of Vicksburg and at Grand Gulf. And we were able to launch the campaign. And after Vicksburg fell on July the 4th, I went into essentially garrison duty. But then in September, Rosecrans moved on Chattanooga, which was a debacle, and was under siege in Chattanooga. I was dispatched to go to Chattanooga and took command of the military district of Mississippi, which was the command of all the Western Theater from the Appalachians to New Orleans, except the area in South Texas and Louisiana where Nathaniel Banks was in command. And I was en route to Chattanooga from Louisville to Nashville, and on October the 20th, I telegraphed Admiral Porter to begin sending vegetables and small rations via the Tennessee River to Bridgeport, Alabama, where they would then be shipped into Chattanooga because the Army of the Cumberland, now under the command of George Thomas, I had relieved Rosecrans, was starving. They actually were starving. Their clothes were falling off them. They've been under siege since September the 20th. It's now October the 20th. By the time I got into Chattanooga, it was October 24th. And they were down to quarter rations. There wasn't a single mule or horse team. They couldn't have pulled one gun. The artillery and men both had enough ammunition to have fought for just an hour or less. And I got into Chattanooga on the 24th and decided to adopt the plan, indeed, that George Thomas had already actually approved and tentatively initiated, planned by W.F. Smith, Baldy Smith, Major General Engineer, who'd been sent, actually he'd fallen from grace with the Army of the Potomac. He said we needed a dictator instead of a president, which did not sit well with President Lincoln. And Baldy was sent to the Army of the Cumberland in Chattanooga. But he had a daring plan to take 60 flatboats that he'd made himself there in Chattanooga with a sawmill he'd captured, and put 1,500 men in the Tennessee River and just let the current pull them and go around Moccasin Bend, floating with the current of the Tennessee River, and then back north again to Brown's Ferry. And that was a 9-mile trip flowing with the current at night. No power, just the current, and steering with oars. But of those 9 miles, 7 of them were within just a few feet or yards of the Confederates on the area around Chattanooga. Daring indeed. But they did it, and on the 27th, 29th rather, I think, of October of 63, we established what they came to call the Cracker Line. They seized Brown's Ferry. General Hazen had led those troops on the flatboats. They seized Brown's Ferry, opened up the Cracker Line, and within just a couple of weeks, the soldiers were well fed and became well armed, which led to the battles of Lookout Mountain and Missionary Ridge, where they destroyed Bragg's army and saved the Army of the Cumberland. I was then later, not too much later, commissioned as Lieutenant General, first since Washington, and was made General-in-Chief of the armies, some 550,000 soldiers under arms, and began the campaign to engage Lee. Now, my first choice was to either go to my right, Lee's left, and go overland, or I could go to my left, Lee's right, through the wilderness. I chose moving to my left through the wilderness because I could stay close to the rivers, the Rapidan, the Potomac, the James, the North Anna, South Anna. I was able to stay close to the rivers where I could get my supplies and armaments, rather than go to my right around the wilderness and have only those supplies that I could carry with me. And I knew that they would not be adequate for the campaign that would be ahead. So I was planning and did use those rivers and chose a path to stay close to those rivers so I could be resupplied and reinforced. And then in the last 11 months of the campaign, we finally brought the war to an end when General Lee surrendered to me on April the 9th of 65. I should like to say, in talking about the Vicksburg campaign, the the success of that effort in Vicksburg was dependent solely upon the cooperation of the Navy. Indeed, even the contemplation of it uh, for its success. And after Vicksburg, and I made this statement, and it applies to my experience with the Navy throughout the war and the use of the rivers and the warfare on the water. I wrote, the Navy under Porter, Admiral David Dixon Porter, was all it could be. Without the assistance, the campaign could not have been successfully made with twice the number of men engaged. It could not have been made at all in the way it was with any number of men without such assistance. The most perfect harmony reigned between the two arms of the service. There never was a request made that I am aware of, either of the flag officer, Admiral Porter, or any of his subordinates, that was not promptly complied with. The rivers were absolutely critical to the success of the Union in the war. My use of those rivers was critical to my success in how I was able to win the campaigns, and ultimately, with all 5 of the federal armies under my command, to bring the war to a successful conclusion. Their importance cannot be overestimated. I have said, for the moment, quite enough, and I shall bring our reflections to an end. I hope you see fit to join me again when I look at the American Civil War and reflect upon the people, places, events, and actions of the war. I bid you adieu.